So lit RPG has been on the rise for, I would say, quite a while now. It's a genre that I have covered quite a bit on this channel, and I will likely cover a decent amount more, as it's something that has been consuming many of my waking hours, both in terms of my reading and my writing of late as well. But what's really unique about lit RPG as a genre is that it is almost exclusively indie. Almost every single author out there is grinding on their own without traditional backing. Almost every single one. There are now a few notable exceptions because I had a chance to read Level Unknown by David Dalglish, which is, to my knowledge, one of the first traditionally published lit RPG novels that we've seen. Obviously, the big one that has to come to mind, the one on the shelf there behind me, of course, is Dungeon Crawler Carl, a series that existed as a serial, completely indie for a while before it got picked up. This, and please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, call out. I know there have been a couple of different examples over the years, but at least in the West, marketed, titled, promoted as a lit RPG. This is my first awareness of one that is a brand new series that's being released. A book that was sold, like an author with an agent sold it to a publisher, in this case, Orbit, which is a pretty big science fiction publisher. And we now get to see sort of the fruits of this labor. I mean, that means that this is a book that's going to appear very likely on more like traditionally stocked bookshelves, places if you're in the States like me, like Barnes and Noble. So I'm really curious to take a look at this. This is one that I had actually seen Orbit post about on social media, and I thought, wait a second, like that's a huge deal for them to sort of take a step forward. And I think honestly, a really big sort of moment for the genre as a whole to finally start to get some of the appreciation of these traditional publishers. Now, is that a route some folks would want to go? Probably. If you're someone who's making like 30K a month just on Patreon promoting your serial, someone who's making seven figures writing indie lit RPG, and there are multiple examples of that now, which is very cool. Probably not. Probably wouldn't want to give any chunks of those royalties away any more than you already have with your audiobook rights. So I would be surprised if some of the more established folks, I bet a bunch of them have been approached, and I'm honestly kind of glad that they haven't sold off those rights. But for new authors, aspiring authors, to know that there are now publishers who are looking to get their hands on lit RPG books, ooh, that is very, very exciting to me. And should it be exciting to you if you're someone who's curious to read this book from an author that I'd never heard of, which is honestly kind of mind boggling given the size of their catalog? 81 books on Amazon? Like, this guy is prolific. Not someone that I'm aware of by any means. So this was a complete, more level unknown, a book unknown, an author unknown for me coming into this. And now as someone who's read a decent amount of lit RPG, I feel pretty confident in being able to sort of see how this stacks up versus other big names or other big series on the market. So let's talk about it. This is, I would say, an atypical portal fantasy story. It actually sort of harkens back to sort of some of the really the original lit RPG web novels, sort of like thinking in the realm of like a Sword Art Online, which is a show that really sort of launched a lot of folks writing more in this style. The idea of living in a VR universe. Basically, this book follows the story of Nick. This takes place far in the future, I would say in sort of an alternate Earth timeline. Nick is an 18-year-old living on a space station, a research space station far off somewhere, I would imagine, in our galaxy, as Earth, like the Sol system is referenced. So I imagine it's not too far away, but they do talk about like wormholes and jumps, so who the heck knows? He is the younger brother of the director of this space station. They do advanced scientific research on this station. It's basically all like high-level scientists, and then this 18-year-old who's sort of brought along because there was some stuff that happened. A few years past. Basically, their mother passed away, and then father was killed in sort of a tragic accident. So this older brother, who's dramatically older, like people live like very, very long at this point in human history, basically says, hey, I'm going to come bring him out on the ship. And they note that it probably just caused some friction and resentment from the other scientists who worked their butts off to get on this assignment of this random 18-year-old like scrubbing beakers in a corner, basically. But the main gist of the plot centers around the fact that they discover an alien artifact. To their knowledge, the first outright alien artifact that has been discovered in human history. It is on this completely barren world, and at first they can't make heads or tails of it. It's this giant, like, dodecahedron. Or it's a large shape. I can't remember how many sides it has. Okay, but it's this like perfect like obsidian material, and they can't interact and engage with it at all. But over time, eventually, they're able to get it to work, and the book basically starts with them activating it. And while it is Nick's older brother Simon who does end up activating it, a handprint appears and they put their hand in it and turns it on. It's actually Nick who gets sucked into a fantasy world. But this is where things get interesting, because we are led to believe that it is a construct of this artifact. For those of you, maybe some older school fans out there who've watched Star Trek TNG, I got huge throwbacks, and I was going to look up the name of the episode before I started this. I'll put it in post here. But it's the episode where they find this long lost artifact from some sort of lost civilization, and Picard basically lives out an entire life as one of the people in that world and sort of forgetting that he was ever on a starship. It's the one with the flute, the really beautiful flute music. Which, like, man, just a tearjerker every time I see that. That's kind of what I got this vibe of this. It basically seems like this world was distilled and encapsulated in this sort of time capsule, and you, the sort of reader, through Nick, are sort of uncovering the secret, like why, what happened to their world. You learn that the world that they're sort of orbiting above, this desolate wasteland, is the world from, that they see it as like this lush, verdant land, like sort of what happened to it. Because the sun is still in the sky, everything seems normal, but there is a second, they call it the black sun, but it kind of is reminiscent of a portal. And basically, Nick goes on this journey to sort of discover what happened with this sort of black portal. Essentially, it sort of ushered in traditionally it ushered in these sort of apocalypses, but the last time it happened, this person ended up becoming the God King Van, or I'll put the spelling on the screen, Van, stop time, completely stop time. The season froze at the 800 years of perpetual spring in order to stop the apocalypse that the black sun ensued. But as a result of that, things are breaking down, things aren't working, things are going wrong. And this book is very much a mystery, sort of uncovering how that goes, because Nick, as it turns out, not as an 18-year-old who's only lived basically on a star station in this sort of remote sort of human colony, not great at things like sword fighting or other stuff. And Nick as a character is interesting. I do think his reactions to sort of being thrown into this, because this was not his knowledge or intention at all, are pretty realistic. I think the response of everyone around him feels a little bit more realistic, which I appreciated, and I'll get into that in a bit. But essentially, he wakes up in this world that at the time they call it Yinsere, and everybody who looks at him thinks that he's a demon. Because again, this is a lit RPG. He basically does have like a stat, and they have this sort of internal system, which has its name, called Cataloger, who is this. She's kind of sassy. She's kind of deadpan. Basically, you don't really get a whole lot of sense of Cataloger, other than there's so much that they can't say. And sort of learning about the world through what she can't say makes it, you sort of have to read between the lines quite a bit with this one, which I thought was interesting. So again, he sort of very typical, wakes up in a field, walks into this small town. Every single person who looks at him can see that he is a visitor. Of course, he doesn't realize this at the start, but they all know that he's a demon and try and kill him and succeed in killing him. And he wakes up back in the real world like, oh my God, it's not if you die in the game, you die in real life. It's if you die in the game, you get to reset and reset. And he resets quite a lot, especially at the beginning, because the people of this town are pretty messed up. Honestly, they are suffering from this blight, turns their tongues black, and it rots their brains, and they kind of turn into zombies, but not quite. And he ends up meeting this sort of holy paladin of the realm, a knight of the God King, Sir Gareth, who's like many, many levels above him, and just gets the crap kicked out of him repeatedly. Nick is just a punching bag at the start of this book. But what it means is that he ends up killing a lot of people. And he does it because he truly believes that he's in a system. He truly believes that this is all a computer-generated world just created for his benefit. Until he meets other people who he realizes aren't from this world. He's not the only one in here, which implies, and you don't get 100%, you basically get confirmation on this throughout the book, because it's slight spoilers, but it's kind of implied right off the bat that there are other artifacts out there and other people are plugging into this world. And he ends up gaining an ally. Her name is Frost, who, is a frost mage, or a spellblade, I guess, in this case. And she sort of takes him under her wing, and they're both around the same age, around like 18, 19 kind of thing. So there is like a slight, very light romancy element in this. And again, together there, she's on a quest for her sister, and sort of that quest evolves into them learning more about the history of this planet, why these sort of desolation apocalypse type things have happened, and then eventually sort of like, okay, well, that sort of what's happening in this VR world, or this maybe. But again, it's heavily implied often that it's like it is also still kind of real, which is really interesting, and that gives Nick gives him some consternation as he's thinking about all the people that he's killed over the course of this. And again, it sort of bleeds into the real world, because there's quite a bit of POV hopping in this, both between Nick and Simon, his older brother, again, who's running the station. And again, who's someone who's older, he's a scientist. I do think what happened outside, sort of with that sort of, there's secondary, and I would say much less so secondary cast of characters, is pretty realistically portrayed. Like, actually pretty impressed. Like, his younger brother's in the system, yes, but more than anything, he's a scientist. They got to do the tests, like they got to put him on like a feeding tube and stuff, because he's basically like neoing it, like in the Matrix, for days at a time. And the real anxiety that he would feel about this, but then also other things start happening out in the real world that they realize are connected, again, as I said, to what's sort of in this VR state. And the mystery of this was definitely the strongest element of it, for sure. I think as a lit RPG and as a story as a whole, it was okay. It was just okay. It was just okay for me. I struggled to get into this a little bit. Again, I wanted to read it to make this video because I was so legitimately curious to read an Orbit published lit RPG book. But I think if I had just picked this up on Royal Road and hadn't, or read this on Royal Road or on Kindle Unlimited, I don't think I probably would have finished it, honestly. Not that it was bad. It was kind of, I mean, it was kind of boring. It just, I have a whole video on this talking about why lit RPG books are so addictive. But it really didn't, to me, it didn't really hit the dopamine hit quite so hard. And I know for folks, again, who are familiar with the genre and read it on places like Royal Road, how the power scaling evolves is very important. The idea of like going from like weak to strong, as an example. He goes from very weak to pretty weak in this book still. Like he can interact with some of the more esoteric elements of this world, and he does get training with a sword. But he still is very much like, he's got like, 100 health, and he's got like a hard stamina bar, which was probably my least favorite mechanic of this whole thing, honestly. You run, and even if you feel like you could run more, if the system doesn't think you can, you just like hit a wall and you're like, I can't move, I'm out of stamina. Like, that to me was the worst mechanic. I wasn't a huge fan of that at all. And it's funny, as I read more and more of these books, the less I'm actually becoming fans of things with just the incredible pages of stat blocks, which this one had some of. It was a lot more contained, for sure. Got to think about those audiobook narrators. I know is the recurring joke. Again, no part of it was bad. It just kind of, again, he's only 18. It was definitely new adult, like a little bit more YA focused. The humor was fine, but wasn't like overly funny. The mystery was there, but not like super compelling. I think because sort of the larger looming imminent threat really didn't materialize till much later in the book and sort of the real world. So otherwise it's just like, oh, it's fun. I can just go in and die over and over again, and it doesn't matter. And for the first chunk of the book, it didn't. It wasn't really until the later half of the book, I don't really think this is spoilers to say, as his body is breaking down, trying to sustain being in this VR world, that you're like, okay, no, there is actually a risk to him doing this. But I think by having this sort of live, die, repeat, Edge of Tomorrow style system, it wasn't a time loop, but the fact that he could just respawn and walk out of the Ring of Stones and go do it again. Some people are really into those stories. And I know regression lit RPG is hugely popular right now. Like, I know this is something that has been done quite a bit. But for me, it definitely sort of cut itself off at the knees right at the start. Now, and again, that he can just completely reset and there's basically no risk to him. He keeps his items. He doesn't lose anything. He still gains his levels in XP. Yeah, it was fine. I think for someone coming in as I imagine this was almost specifically dumbed down to sort of be an introduction for people coming in and learning lit RPG. This feels like it didn't really push anything in any direction. And it was sort of underpinned by a bit of a bland cast, honestly. Like, no one really jumped out at me as, like, honestly, like the sort of AI LF systems of the was sort of the funniest components of this. And again, when you don't end up with your main character being able to punch a hole in a mountain, which they don't have to obviously in the first book, but like it didn't really necessarily they didn't really show us. Oh, I'm actually even saying this. I'm realizing, I think, part of what the problem is. In a lot of big other lit RPG series, you see where the potential can go. You see someone, our character is class E, and you see someone in class B or class A who can, like, fly through space and destroy a planet with the wave of their hand, or raise an army of 1,000 skeletal minions in, an instant. You get a benchmark of where they can end up. You have somewhere that they can go aspirationally. And yes, the God King Van is sort of referenced and kind of makes vague, shadowy appearances on the edge of this. We really don't get to see that, other than that we hear, oh, they can stop time for an entire world. But there's really only one character that has that kind of power. So again, we don't really get the sense of where it's going to go. Again, the magic system is I wouldn't say super well developed. It's basically just a very standard elemental magic system with hard capped mana point costs on spells, which I don't particularly love. I'm more a fan of like more will-based systems where, like, yes, there's maybe a mental energy and strain element to it, but like, as long as you still have the energy and stuff or the willpower to keep casting, you can, because I do think it limits those sort of like anime level up moments that we all love and adore, and I think are a key part of the gameplay loop, the dopamine run that is a lit RPG series. So yeah, it was fine. Again, the cast of characters was okay. It just read a little young, and I think we have a lot of common elements in this right now, where we're doing this a lot in lit RPG, where we're, especially with Portal Fantasy, Isekai, that kind of stuff, where the character is young. And I think, for at least for myself, and I imagine for quite a few other people as well, starting with a character who's a little bit older, a little bit more mature, has a little bit more wherewithal, I think would have honestly done a lot here. I think the fact that he was still very much like an 18-year-old, but acted like a 16-year-old in some cases, definitely hurt the story a little bit. Again, the writing was fine. Wasn't anything to write home about. Now that's, fine in this context is like better than probably 70% of lit RPGs from like a pure prose standpoint. It head hopped as it needed to. It carried enough characters as it needed to. But one of the, I think the key elements then, as I'm reading more in the genre, that I realize you need those moments of the main character doing something utterly badass. They need to go wipe the floor with 100 enemies or beat up someone way above their level. They need to make the ground shake and the gods, pay attention. And they need to cut to someone else looking at them going like, holy crap, that guy's a badass. What the heck? Wow, we need to keep an eye on him. Like, seeing our protagonist being amazing, or being, a little bit broken, having an OP skill, punching above their weight from someone else's lens, is part of what makes the genre great. Is you get to kind of be giddy with, ooh, look at our guy. You know what I mean? Like, those moments, I think, have become, again, the more I read this, I realize are so integral to the genre as much as anything else. It's not just about seeing the numbers go up. It's about having other people appreciate that our characters' numbers are going up. And that, I think, is something that this book really didn't accomplish at all. And again, it's only book one. There's clear desire for more of them. I don't know how many they sold, but they've already announced the second one is coming. I imagine maybe there's a couple of them written and they're going to be done rapid release. Maybe I can pull this up right now, actually. Let me see if I can. Yeah, I just looked it up. The next one is going to come out on May 13th. So only a few months away. So they're doing a rapid release format with this, which suggests to me, the cover hasn't been revealed, which suggests to me they wrote a bunch of these and sold it as a series to the publisher. So that's interesting. Very, 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 very cool. I don't know if I'll keep reading this series. For those of you who end up picking it up, this doesn't have like almost any reviews on Amazon. I'm honestly kind of surprised. Again, given that it's coming from what is a fairly significant sci-fi publisher in the space. Honestly, kind of surprised it hasn't gotten a little bit more traction. So who knows? We'll see if this ends up picking up. Again, I don't know if I'd continue with this series. I don't know if it was necessarily hooked enough for me, but if you do end up reading it, let me know down in the comments. Again, it's free on Kindle Unlimited if you have that, which I imagine a lot of you folks in the lit RPG space probably do. Let me know what you guys think. Did you get into it? Did you find the world compelling? Did you find the mystery compelling? Did you feel like it owned the lit RPG, the RPG elements of it enough, with its sort of weird hybridized stat system and going far in some directions and not a lot in others? Was it crunchy enough? Those are the questions that I have for you. Again, if you enjoyed this video, I'm going to be making a lot more of this kind of content. Guys, I've gone down the LitRPG rabbit hole and I can't stop. I'm so, like, if you're, there's going to be other, I have other books. I have big fantasy series, some other big sci-fi series I need to finish. So there's going to be more on the channel. But if you're into this kind of stuff and you enjoy this content, of course, be sure to hit subscribe and like this video as well. And I do have a bunch of social media accounts that I'm trying to be more active on. The links to those are down in the description if you're curious to follow more with the day-to-day stuff. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Cheers.